Well, good morning and welcome, everyone. We are looking forward to a lively discussion on free speech challenges to illiberal and authoritarian states. My name is Samar. I'm going to be your moderator today. I'm a research professor of law and political science here at Vanderbilt, where I also co-chair the project on unity in American democracy and run a nonprofit called Millions of Conversations that focuses on how to bring people together around common values for a shared future. I have to tell you that in preparing for this panel, the conversation was quite lively. So I'm hoping that we're going to be able to bring some of that liveliness here as well. And one of the things we also want to make sure that we do is leave plenty of time for discussion with all of you so that we can really hear your questions and thoughts and considerations as well. So we're going to do this in 4 parts. I'm going to do have the privilege to do the introduction here of my esteemed colleagues to my right. We're going to allow them to open up with some remarks and their own personal stories. Then I'm going to moderate the panel with a couple of questions, and then we're going to open it up to Q&A. So without further ado, I will introduce to my far right here, I'm going to go by our first names, Faisal, and I'll tell you 3 things, although I could tell you 30 things about each of them because they're so fascinating, but I'll tell you 3 things about each of them that I think is worth knowing and relevant to the panel discussion today. Faisal is the founder of Ideas Beyond Borders. He's a practitioner of countering extremism and misinformation internationally all over the world. And he received the President's Volunteer Service Award from President Obama a few years ago. Sitting to his left, we have Chidi, who is a professor of practice and international human rights law at the Fletcher School at Tufts University, where he also chairs the Truth, Justice, and Peace Commission, and he previously chaired the Nigerian National Human Rights Commission. And sitting right to my immediate right, Rodrigo is a Venezuelan human rights activist. He's the co-founder and president of an international NGO, which in English is called A World Without Censorship. And he is known for his successful grassroots organizing, so much so that he's received awards for it, called from the Medal of Rome and also the World Economic Forum. So please join me with a warm welcome in welcoming our guests today. Thank you. So if we could start with your introductory remarks for each of you. Faisal, we'll start with you. And let's answer 2 questions, please. The first question is, what are the core values of free speech from where you sit? And can you give us a relevant story or personal story about where you witnessed free speech being curtailed or the demise of free speech that led to a slipping into an authoritarian state?
Well, thank you so much, Samar, for the introduction. Thank you all for being here. Unfortunately, I did not, the history of Iraq, when I was born in 1991, so my first experience with Iraq was the US invasion of Iraq, and before that was the regime of Saddam Hussein. So my first experience with authoritarianism was during the sanctions and during the the period between the first Gulf War and the second Gulf War, was that the Iraqi government, the Saddam Hussein government, has pretty much banned most of media, and there were only 2 channels, one run by Saddam Hussein and the other one run by his son. So when I was growing up, my dad and I used to be at around 1 or 2 in the morning listening to radio being broadcasted to us from Jordan, Kuwait, and neighboring countries. The most famous one was Monte Carlo, which is a French channel that used to broadcast into Iraq about opposition voices and the life of opposition to Saddam Hussein outside of Iraq. And then also Radio Sawa, which was actually part of the US Agency for Global Media, or the Voice of America type. So that was my first experience of for us to seek information, you actually had to work hard for it. If you are connected more to the government, which was the ruling party, the Ba'ath Party, you were able to, on satellite television, you were able to have freedom of speech. So in a way, freedom of speech and access to information is very much connected to the hierarchy and the allegiance you have to the political establishment. And then that regime was removed in 2003, as many of you know. But then the country descended from, I call it we went from 1984 to Brave New World. So we went from absolute authoritarianism, of controlled authoritarianism, into a place in we don't know what the truth or any centralized form of information. So each kind of the country descended into a civil war, and each kind of neighborhood and each province had its own media channel, to the way that even if there was any attack or suicide bombing or any form of terrorism, you can talk to 10 different peoples who have 10 different sources of information, and they can tell you completely different stories about what happened. So in a way is that all of the media was kind of decentralized. The militia started having their own channels, the political parties, etc. So in a way we went from like one version of the truth, which was what the government said, into like nobody knows what the truth is. And then eventually everything kind of destroyed. So really my kind of interest in this subject came first into like obviously the freedom part and kind of making knowledge accessible and fighting authoritarianism. But the other piece is actually how can people have a healthy relationship with information? And that's where actually a lot of our work is really focused on media literacy and critical thinking, in which we don't tell people what to think, but how to think, which is like there's all of these thousands of media sources, and each one of them is telling you a different story about what happened. How can you actually know what's true and what's false? And unfortunately, that work is not liked by some of these militias. So some of my team and I are on couple death lists and death threats, but it's a work that I think needs to be done. And thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Chidi, would you like to go next? And also if we could just answer that question on the values piece too, which I think is so critical.
Thanks a lot. I think I'll say two things to begin with. One is just looking at this panel, I don't want the subliminalism to come out that authoritarianism comes from one part of the world and freedom of speech lives in another part of the world, because there is something inherent in the composition of this panel that could lend itself to that kind of conclusion. And from the conversations in the last panel, it seems quite evident to me that we are not in either or. Most societies have in them tendencies that are authoritarian and tendencies that support freedom. And we're here because there's a contest between those tendencies in most societies. And at some point, one tendency may well have the edge over the other. But it's actually, it's cyclic. And in many ways, that reflects my sense and experience with questions of free speech in most of the parts of the world I work in, which are, for the most part, in the global south. I'm Nigerian, and anyone who knows Nigerians will know you cannot put us down. No amount of authoritarian infrastructure will stop Nigerians from getting their message across or their point of view across. It doesn't mean that people have not tried. I was born inside a civil war as an IDP under military rule. It doesn't get more difficult than that. I've spent my life, I've spent 10 years in exile, or 12 years in exile, over 2 cycles. I've chaired my country's National Human Rights Commission. I've been detained 4 times doing that. But I will still struggle, and I will not call my country authoritarian. Are there authoritarian tendencies, though? Absolutely, they exist in the country, right? And the people battle it, and we will continue to battle it. And that really is the fun of free speech. But what is one thing that strikes me at this time? And that's the thing I pushed back against, the point about culture. I do think that what we have now, particularly in a lot of developing countries, is a marriage between Queen Victoria and Mark Zuckerberg. And it's really amazing because the infrastructure, the legal infrastructure that governs free speech for the most part was written in colonial times, but actually the contents were written in the time of Charles Dickens. And reference was made to Charles Dickens here yesterday. That was when the substance of that infrastructure was done. What we now do have is by the way, a digital age in which everyone can say what they like. And what governments are doing is working with the platforms in a lot of developing countries to make life unbearable for citizens trying to do their work. And when I hear people, Americans, sit down here and tell me, oh, you know, platforms are exercising their free speech rights, I can't stop laughing. It is beyond ludicrous. Now, when a platform is working with my government to make sure that I do not have free speech, and the Americans are sitting down in the comfort of Vanderbilt University and telling me how that is free speech right, I don't want to speak in expletives, but I do think that people need to understand that there is a world beyond the United States, and that world also is entitled to free speech. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Rodrigo. I'm an activist for Venezuela. I've been an activist all my life, as I remember. I started when I was 18 years old. And I'm going to start first answering the first question. What are the values, intrinsic values of freedom of speech? I think that number one is to not being afraid of saying what you think. That's the most important one. But then you need to have the means to express your opinion. You need to find a way. If you want to create a press conference, you need to have access to media so other people can hear you, or through social media. You need means to express your opinions or creating a forum. And third, of course, is access to information. If you don't have access to information, your opinion will be blind and it will not be, could never understand reality and their full capacity. And that's why it's so important for regimes to censor information. The best way to censor free speech and having an opinion is by censoring first the access to information, because you basically create your opinion based on the information that you have. So I'm going to talk about my story for a couple of minutes. I started when I was 18 years old. My grandma went to a protest. She voted for Chavez, who was the guy who was before Maduro. So Chavez was trying to introduce ideology into the educational system of Venezuela. So she went to a protest because she felt responsible for voting for him. And they throw tear gas and rubber bullets at her. So she called me. This was back in 2001. It was like my first week, my second week at the university. And she said, we're going to lose the country. These people are, this is going to be fully authoritarian. So I said, don't worry, Grandma, I'm going to go with you to the next protest. And then I see with my own eyes how, relative older than me people around 60 and 70s were in the protest, and they were aggressively beaten by the militaries. And I understood that something was going in the wrong way. Of course, Chavez made 2 coup d'etats in the past. And he killed, or his group, they killed 100 civilians before arriving to power. So I understood that, of course, this guy is not a democratic guy. I don't know why Venezuelans vote for a guy who made 2 coup d'etats and killed 100 innocent people. We pay the result of that voting. And one day, 6 months after, I was in a protest, and I saw how a guy was shot in the leg. So I went after him, tried to support him, and when we moved him to another place, a friend of mine told me, did you see the guy that is laid on the floor dead? I said, no. When I turned back, I just saw a guy laid on the floor dead, almost exactly the same place that I was. And I just struck, hit me in the face and said, that could have been me. So, of course, we left that protest. And since then, I tried to honor this person. Because I said, I don't know who this guy was going to be. And I needed to honor this person to fulfill his mission, the reason why he died for, the freedom of Venezuela. Of course, I never thought I was going to last that long. So 23 years after, I'm still in the fight. I always thought that this year was going to be the year that we were going to win this fight, and actually had happened the opposite. As you might know, Venezuela have the largest refugee crisis in the world right now. We were the richest nation of South America, and we are compared with, in the in some index with Haiti in the levels of poverty, and also with lack of medicines and scarcity of food. And everything that happened in Venezuela is related to the reduction of freedom of expression. We're going to talk about that later. But me as an activist, I can say that I have seen with my own eyes how a strong democracy can be completely destroyed through the destruction of freedom of expression as the main objective of the dictatorship. And then the rest as a result of that. So I want to start with that.
Wow. Very powerful. Thank you. So each of you, what I'm hearing is you have risked your lives and you've seen others risk their lives in the name of defending free speech. Why? Why is it so important? Why is it so fundamental? I mean, you touched on it a little bit, Rodrigo, but what is it about free speech? Why is it in the First Amendment in the Constitution of the United States, for example?
I mean, I see it as the seed of everything else. I mean, when people are, if people are, I mean, it depends on which kind of school you go to free speech from, but I come from the kind of the liberal school, and it's focused on the idea of the individual, and the individual have the right for them to express their beliefs and believe whatever they want, and etc. So I think is that when you have that, then in a way that we can have externalities of innovation and the ability for you to thrive in a kind of a global economy. So I think I see the ability for people to thrive, not just as a kind of a good ideal where people can, but we're seeing it right now is that the more countries that actually have more freedom tend to have the freedom for them to be more innovative. That being said, in the Middle East, we actually did a very interesting bargain, which that some countries have rates very high on economic freedom, and that's where the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia and Qatar, etc., where you have very low income tax and you actually have able to innovate through economic ways, but at the same time they have very restrictive free speech policies. So in a way, it's like we're trying to disprove Milton Friedman's theory that economic freedom leads to political freedom. So that's the job of the region. But at the same time, when you actually talk to a lot of people within the UAE and within many of these countries, they still believe that even when they actually make investments, they mostly tend to invest in American companies and countries where there is relative respect for property rights, respect for freedom of speech, etc. So even within their kind of mindset, which is, okay, if we give people lower taxes and we give them economic freedom, that's good. But then when you see their decisions, you see that they're more likely when they actually build sovereign wealth funds, when they actually invest in other countries, they most likely invest in places where there is respect for property rights, there is respect for free speech, which tells you about the contradiction. So I think is that it's the concept is realized, but I can go to the kind of the history of the region. I mean, Jacob has written a chapter on the kind of the Islamic history or within the Abbasid Caliphate of there was some relative freedom on some situations. But I think there's now, as the war happens now in Gaza and Lebanon and other places, there's a very famous Arabic proverb that says, "La sawt ya'lu ala sawt al-ma'raka," which means that there should be no voice above the voice of the battle. So when there is a war, there you have to shut up. So technically that's the summary of it, which is George W. Bush have used to some extent when he says you're either with us or against us. But the problem with the Middle East is that we have been at war for 5,000 years. So in a way is that you actually don't have the ability to speak up your mind much, because every time you want to speak up about something, they tell you, well, there's war happening and you have to shut down your mouth. Well, some kind of relative differences. Freedom House does a good job on kind of differentiating between places like Tunisia, were kind of considered the birthplace of the Arab Spring, that had some relative freedom, in Lebanon, compared to other places like Iran and Syria, where there is actually almost non-existent laws that protect free speech. So that being said, people are seeing that the Arab Spring and other places are kind of resemblance, that there is some elements within society that is yearning for freedom, and there is always a competition between those who are in the authoritarian space, who actually have good arguments of trying to provide economic security, trying to provide safety, etc., and that's what makes them appealing, compared to us, the chaotic people who are fighting for freedom.
Thank you. Chidi.
Do I have to add to that?
Do you
I can just adopt what you have said as mine and move
do
it
whatever you want to. You can say whatever you
Yeah,
want.
so because I'm sure there are lots of other things to cover.
Okay.
But I don't want to. I really don't want. I totally adopt what's been said, and I don't think the only thing I want to add, probably just so that I don't totally become a waste of time here, is that the civic commons is worth defending. Okay? I mean, free speech is not just about the fact that, as we heard this morning, we can communicate with our neighbors. And sometimes, before you get those neighbors, you can get a life partner. No. It's also about the fact, actually, that, we all live in communities where commons exist. And those commons are necessary for our respective lives to have meaning. And if nobody defends those commons, our lives are worthless. And so the civic commons, actually, the defense of the civic commons is essential to our very existence. So if you don't care about your civic commons, your life has no meaning. Your life is denuded. And to that extent, it's not just about intersubjectivities. There is a self-interest in asserting the defense of the civic commons. For me, that is where it ends. And wherever you identify as your place, you've got to commit with everything you've got to making sure that civic commons is viable for you.
So to be provocative on that, and some of the things that you've said earlier too, so just to kind of to frame that, the reason I asked that question is that there are a lot of people right now who are saying that they feel safer under an authoritarian context than a democratic one, because they'll point to freedom of speech and say, look what happens to societies that have it. You'll look at research or polls that were done 5 years ago of people saying, would you rather be under the American superpower that's a democracy or a Chinese superpower that's authoritarian? And the majority of people answered US, American. They did the same poll about a year ago, and people were moving towards China because they said they felt safer, and look at how many people have died in a democratic state than an authoritarian one. So I'm putting that frame there because it's part of the debate and part of the discussion that's happening right now of where people will say, is freedom of speech actually the better way?
I think there are two challenges with framing it that way. One is identifying freedom of speech with America.
Let's get into
exactly.
it.
So that reductionism doesn't work.
So critique it, please. Critique Americans.
No, it's not possible
context.
to identify freedom of speech with America. America does not give anybody freedom of speech.
Why?
Because it doesn't.
Why not?
What business does America have with my freedom of speech?
No, I know. I thought you meant it has no business of speech of governing freedom of speech in the United States.
That's for Americans to decide. It's not my problem. I'm dealing with freedom of speech in my right. place. So Americans have to sort out their country. I'm sorting out my country. It's as simple as that.
Right, agreed.
So this is not my problem. America is not my problem. Okay? I've got a Nigerian problem. And the United States is not going to fix my Nigerian problem. And I'm not going to fix the United States problem. So that's number one. Number two is the idea of an implicit trade-off between speech rights and safety and security. Speech rights are safety and security rights. That's the first thing. I need, when you're in trouble, the first thing you do is scream. That is the first instinct. The second thing is run. Okay? Those are the two things, fight or flight. So the idea, therefore, that we bifurcate those two or have them in opposition to one another is logically and experientially and evidentially unviable, in my view. Thank you.
Actually, may I jump in? Rodrigo, you give me permission?
Please.
Okay, thank you. So that's actually some of the work we have done during COVID, and actually during that period, Russia Today has one of the largest Arabic channels called Russia Today Arabic, which has millions of followers. And then the other channel is CGTN, which is the Chinese official television. And one of the things they actually were broadcasting during that time was they show women in Beijing or other places in China walking at 3 in the morning at night. And then they show protests of Black Lives Matter and like Walgreens being destroyed and things like that. And through that, they were actually sending messages of saying, what type of world do you want to live in? Do you want to, and they were obviously targeting Middle Eastern cultures with this message because Middle Eastern cultures tend to be more conservative and more kind of protective of women's dignity and honor and things like that. And they had, what was interesting about that they had Chinese journalists who spoke fluent Arabic. It was really smart, Arabic is not the easiest language to be fluent at. And as a result, they went viral because everybody was like, who are these Chinese people speaking fluent Arabic? So that's actually how the video went viral. And then within the messages, it was, there are two walls here. One is women can walk free in the morning at 3 in the morning, and then everybody's driving Lamborghinis and Porsche, which I call it Lamborghini authoritarianism. So that's the thing that they were pushing. And then they show what America was. It's like they show videos of Baltimore and Washington, D.C., and crime and homeless people. And then they were giving the people the choice. And I would say that in the Middle East where we work, I mean, actually, I do care about freedom in America because it does affect what's happening elsewhere. But is that many people in the Middle East, unfortunately, have taken that bargain. Like even there is an Arab Barometer report, which I think affiliated with the University of Michigan, that does a lot of surveys, and most people will generally tend towards security, which is we would rather have that, or would rather have women walking 3 in the morning, or have the jobs. And then when you talk even like to Jordanians and other countries, they will tell you, you know what, politics is for the people above. It's a very intellectual thing. It's very smart. Only smart people can discuss politics. And when I mean by politics, it depends on, we're talking about criticizing the monarchy. But for the rest of us, we can do economics, we can make money, we can go to Greece and have fun. However, in the Middle East, we have a lot of culture of politics, so it's very difficult. But at the same time, that's, I would say, the bargain that, at least according to polls, which are obviously hardly to be accurate when you're working in places where there is a lot of authoritarianism, but there is a lot of technology now with anonymous surveys and stuff like that where you can actually gather some info. So yes, I mean, the message is working. I mean, I can tell you that the message of China, let's say it as an example of Lamborghini authoritarianism, because China is not selling the North Korean model. They're not selling that everybody gonna have famine and starving in the street. They're selling that you can have a very safe life, a very good job, and you can travel around the world and be safe. They're not selling the old school Soviet Union socialism where you see a line in the Soviet Union looking for bread. They're actually selling a prosperity and authoritarianism, or what they call social cohesion or security. And I think those of us who believe in the larger freedom model need to do a better job in communicating that you can be free and rich at the same time. I think that should be the message of the free world.
Rodrigo, please.
Try to answer in the two questions. First, why we fight for freedom, why we put ourselves at risk. At the beginning, for freedom of speech. At the beginning, I started my fight for as I mentioned, for the for democracy in my country. And then I understood the importance of freedom of speech, because first I saw it that is the only human rights that allow you to defend the other human rights. So you have this transversal effect. So you have to be in a position that you have to be more protected in that sense, because it's the only one to help you to defend the rest of your human rights. And once you take that out from the table, everything will go down like a domino effect. So, and going back to what happened in Venezuela, the destruction of the regime never had political prisoners, maybe one or two, until they have full control of the media. They never tried to change the constitution until they have full control of the media. We never have economical crisis until they have full control of the media. All the disaster that came into Venezuela occurred after they controlled the media. I understand that in the past because there was a huge protest at the beginning, well, the same day that this person was killed in front of me, and they lose power for 3 days, and they understood how powerful media is to mobilize people. So before they continue the authoritarian road, first they try to gain when they recovered power in 3 days after, because mistakes of the position, of course. They first try to gain popularity again. They increase polarization. Polarization is a powerful tool to destroy democracy. You have to, basically, the formula of the regime was polarization and destruction of freedom of expression. Because polarization is what helps you to justify your anti-democratic actions, right? And then the freedom of expression is what allows you to control society. So, and democracy can be destroyed completely, because, so I'm trying to connect that with the previous question. Democracy is not an important value for daily routine, like for people who are trying to survive their own life. This is just more like an abstract, like what are the benefits of democracy? It's not clear for people. So, and also sometimes freedom of speech is a privilege because they say, okay, I don't use social media, I don't go to TV, like who cares about freedom of speech? I just want to have a better life, so I prefer security. And I think Venezuela is also a good case of that. They vote for someone who was completely anti-democratic, a guy who was completely anti-freedom of speech. By the way, when this guy, I just realized when this Chavez arrived to power, his first coup attack, he entered into the national TV channel and killed 5 people to take control of that TV channel to send his message, like a V for Vendetta type. And of course, people knew that he was against democracy, against freedom of speech, but they didn't care, and he won. So basically, these are not our primary instincts that we have, at least the majority of the people, the necessity to have democracy and freedom of speech, that this will resolve all your problems. So that's why it's so important to remind people and to act every time that freedom of speech or democratic values are under attack. And just to answer the first question of why we do what we do and why we put ourselves at risk, sometimes I have to do a lot with your sensitivity for oppression. For example, me as a Venezuelan, I will never stop fighting for freedom of expression and democracy around the world, no matter if we recover democracy. I can't. And the reason of this is that I already suffer enough to understand the pain that it means to lose your country or to live under an oppressive regime. So basically, I'm just like cheering for the moment when we finally recover democracy, to start using all this knowledge of how we recover democracy and start to apply it in other countries like Nicaragua, Cuba, and many other countries around the world. At least it will be a useful way to implement all that I have learned, but also a great way to honor, what it means to lose your country and what it means to believe under authoritarian regime.
Yeah, I mean, I like that Rodrigo has a strong emotional resonance with this. I think which actually brings back to my point. We need to do a very good job explaining why these values are important to begin with. And for us, like part of our work is like now with the kind of the use of technology, you can do a lot of A/B testing. So you can send 10 videos to multiple audiences, and then you can actually get feedback loops and what works and what resonates, and you can kind of measure not the impact, but how people respond to messages. And one of actually really interesting kind of videos that we did about democracy that sort of work, which was that, I'm sure here we're talking about liberal democracy. So there's also a different, Chidi Hamid, who's the author of the Brookings Institute, made the case that illiberal democracies are important. And that actually what happened in Iraq is that liberal democracy was mostly used as a kind of a mob rule, of majority rule, of using the vote against the minority, and that is what led to. So when America tried to bomb democracy into Iraq, which obviously did not work, as many of you know, it built a democracy that was not a liberal democracy. It was actually a democracy that is the Shias, who are the majority, used to actually gain power, to kill and discriminate against the Sunnis and other places. But back to the kind of the concepts of kind of how to make people care. Many people in the Middle East, as you know, have lived a lot of wars, and unfortunately the conversation about war is daily to us. And we did these kind of 2 videos that were really interesting, which was about the war in Ukraine and about the difference when you have feedback loops in the military circle when you don't have feedback loops. And the Russian military doesn't have feedback loops. It's actually a very hierarchy-oriented, it's authoritarian army of authoritarian countries. So everything actually has to go all the way up, in which everything has to be approved by the chain of command for things to happen. America is actually very different. The chain of command within America, loopholes within or kind of feedback loops within American military is actually very different, in which the sergeant can actually make decision even if the general has not actually approved it or he needs to approve it. And then through that, we actually showed that if you create a system that when there are healthy feedback loops, you would actually understand better war and understand life than if you have a centralized model in which all the decision has to be made from the chain of command and above. And then we made like comparison of like, this is what you have in different countries in the Middle East where you actually have one chain of command and there is absolutely no feedback loop. And the video went so viral of people actually understanding that democracy is actually as simply as having a feedback loop between the society and the governance. I think it's like we can, with the uses of technology and now with artificial intelligence and some of the new tools, we can actually understand better what works and what resonates. Because as Rodrigo said, when most of the people care about, not to generalize, I sound like elite by saying most of the people, but I mean, generally speaking, people want have food for their families and want to have a good life. And for them, this kind of very like abstract ideas of freedom and democracy and blah, blah, is not going to actually touch many of them. But if we actually showed the benefits individually of how that, even when we had success, not when I hijacked the panel, we had success with a lot of religious minorities within Iraq because we showed them that actually democratic ideas, a liberal democracy is beneficial to them. And that's where we are able to actually build a coalition within the Iraqi government that actually supports these values because they saw it as beneficial to them, not just an abstract ideas and mumbo jumbo.
Thank you. Chidi.
If I may add one or two things. You know, a dog doesn't just want to chew bones. A dog needs to bark, okay? And a barking dog, a dog that doesn't bark is not a dog in many ways. So, you know, the old joke about the Algerian and the Tunisian dog, which met at the boundary, you know, the Algerian dog trying to go to Tunisia, and asked, and he said he wanted to go eat food. This was under the Ben Jedid administration. And the Tunisian dog trying to head to Algeria, where there was some hunger, and the Algerian dog asking, what the hell are you going to that forlorn place to do? And the Tunisian dog said, the Tunisian dog under Zinabdin, I need to go to bark, right? So that right to bark is really what we're talking about here. But there is a second dimension to that which I think is important right now. And which for me is for me the normative intellectual challenge with the tenor of the conversation since yesterday. There is a civil libertarian overemphasis, in my view, in our conversation on free expression. For many of us, for certainly my part of the world, part of what is happening these days is, you know, most media have migrated to digital platforms. And the free expression now is mediated by corporate power. Corporate power of the platform owners and platform providers. And many of them, so what happens? The government wants to switch you off. They put pressure on the companies, and traffic to the website of the news medium is turned off. Or you want to organize a demonstration, and the digital platform simply, or the owner of your operators of your telephone networks are simply told to crash your communications. And that way, you are no longer able to, you now have to resort to analog methods to organize, and the government picks you up as you're trying to do that. And that means what? Normatively, we're not just talking about free speech, we are talking about the right to privacy, data. And I've not heard enough since yesterday about the intersection, the vast intersection, as we speak, between traditional libertarian, civil libertarian free speech rights and the intersection with data. So Jacob's book on free speech begins in Greece and ends up in social media. And it seems to me we've got to navigate that entire value chain. Getting stuck in First Amendment rights and talking about that does not address the fact that most of our conversations on free speech today happen within the zone of the right to privacy. What does that mean? What are the implications of that normatively, functionally, for free speech? I do think that is missing from the conversation so far. Thank you.
Definitely agree. Rodrigo, please go ahead, and then we're going to open up to Q&A.
Yes, no, I just wanted to use my freedom of expression and have a different point of view than my good friend here, Chidi. By the way, I love yesterday when they talked that the importance of having discomfort and stress is very important to know if you have freedom of expression. If there's no real debate and discomfort, and the right and we say the importance that if you're being offended, that doesn't justify censoring someone. But I'm saying that because he said that he doesn't care, or he's not like, or the way I understand it, you don't care as much as what will happen in freedom of expression in the U.S. Like that's their problem. And that I was impressed by that. I didn't understand it because two things. I think that the fight for freedom, first, the fight for freedom is the fight for humankind. We have been always gaining year by year since 200,000 years ago, more freedom. And that's the trajectory of the humankind. If we have a spirit or we're just a species, that's where we're always aiming. And the fight for freedom and the fight for freedom of speech increase where the fight is being done. For example, if Venezuela recovered democracy, I hope this happens finally soon, the ones who are going to benefit not only be Venezuelans, they're going to be Hungary, we're going to be Nicaragua, Cuba, Hong Kong, everywhere. Because first, that will give so much energy and hope for other countries. But basically, the fight for democracy and against authoritarian is not being fight in the US only or in Europe. It's being fight where the change can happen. And the same happened to freedom of expression. The US is the most important country in the world. So the quality of freedom of expression here will affect everybody because it's the first example that we all see. So even it's more important to fight for freedom of expression, as the way I see it, in the US than in other countries, because it will have a domino effect on the rest of the world. So, and at the end, I just want to finish that I don't like this vision of them and us. I think we should see ourselves just as humans. I would love to think that in 1,000 years, we'll not have the division that we have, because we understand that at the end, we're all the same. And I think that division of them and us is what is creating this tragedy in Gaza, is because the Israelis see themselves, they have to protect from them as a completely separate thing than us, when we are all humans. And of course, they have to defend their country, but that doesn't mean they have to go after and kill everybody because they are them and we are us. If they didn't have that division between them and us, they would have never done this massive attack in thousands of innocents, because it will hurt them as much as the people that were killed from their side. And as long as we don't develop that empathy for the other and we see that we are all the same, these tragedies will continue. So that's why I think it's very important to have that point of view. At least that's my opinion.
Thank you. Let's go ahead and turn to you all for questions.
Great points, Rodrigo.
Good morning. Thank you so much for that. I'm surprised that this may be necessary, but perhaps someone needs to quote Chomsky and say, of course, Goebbels agreed with free speech. For free speech he liked. So did Stalin. But to believe in free speech is to believe in the right for those who you most profoundly disagree with to speak. And I think comments with respect to the development of truth and safety are ironic in a place like this. With all due respect, what the fuck are any of us doing at a global free speech summit and hearing such basic comments like that. And the question I have for the panel is, why is the principled perspective so hard? It seems that to defend free speech for free speech we like is a fundamentally human condition. Censorship is also a human condition for free speech we don't like. Why is it so hard for us to appreciate what you're saying, Rodrigo, that we are so common, we share so much, and that the defense of free speech for our opponent is the basis of the freedom on which we stand?
Let's take two. Let's just do two. Oh, sorry? Are you pointing, Chidi? Yeah, here.
Yeah, so this is kind of in line with what he was asking, but in 1989, the Washington Post posted that democracy had won, but ever since then, we've only seen the decline of democracy and like the erosion of freedom of speech across the world. And so I ask, like, how can we better sell the ideals of democracy and freedom of speech against the backdrop of, as you describe it, China's like Lamborghini authoritarianism?
Maybe I could jump in. And actually, kind of to add what Rodrigo is, I mean, I remember my first kind of exposure to the concept of freedom of speech was reading a badly translated version of On Liberty by John Stuart Mill in Arabic. And when I read it, my first interpretation was not that freedom of speech was just for white people. It was a universal concept that needs to be defended. And when he goes into kind of the rights of minorities and the fact that it protects dissent opinion. So I think it's like we do need to do a very good job of really dismantling these concepts from the West or America and things like that, and look at them from the universality of these concepts and the importance of these concepts for the beneficiary of mankind, humankind, and now being exclusive, humankind. So I think that's what I think, because of the complex geopolitical history between countries in the Middle East and the West, or Africa and the West, etc., of wars and colonialism and things like that, one of the main challenges happen for people like us is that we immediately get accused of kind of being agents of the West or agents of the CIA or the Zionist entity and things like that. So I think it's like we need to do a better job. And I think we're trying to crack the codes of really trying to, I'm really learning, not to use the word enemy, but I'm really learning a lot from China. It's like, the fact is that you have to sell your idea of how it's beneficial to the people. And how it's the fact that minority opinions, if they're respected, they're beneficial. How does the freedom of speech and the culture of freedom of speech leads to innovation and successful economies? So we actually have to do a better job in really, and instead of talking about the theoretical, instead of like, oh, you have to be Western and you have to follow what the West, every country gonna follow its own history and its own path. But that's, I think, the way to go in succeeding in creating the wall that post-Berlin Wall fall.
And if we could just be a little bit brief in our answers so that we could try to get to everybody. Thank you.
Sorry.
Chidi, you picked up the microphone, so.
No, by the way, Rodrigo and I, on that point you made last, we totally agree. But the fact of the matter is that free speech is a very deeply political, in the way I conceive it, is deeply political and deeply civic. And civic constructions are not transplanted from one context to the other. So we can have free speech in the context of transnational solidarity. That's different from free speech as a civic construction. Only American citizens can vote in American elections. Full stop, I'm not one. Now, so talking about the other issues, really, there isn't, I'd rather pass on that because I think the point has been made,
yes.
And we have little time.
Let's go. Over here, please.
My name's Nadia. I'm from the Free Speech Union in New Zealand, and while we come up against fights against censorship on a weekly and sometimes daily basis, I think we have a lot more freedom than some of the examples that we've been given. But I think that's exactly why we've got to fight against censorship now, and I think it should be a motivation to fight against it. But sometimes the people we communicate to say, yeah, but we won't end up as bad as other countries. From your experience of bearing the cost of losing free speech, what would you say to those people that write off the examples of censorship that we see?
Let me get one more question too. Yeah.
Hi, I'm an undergraduate student from China, and I definitely agree with all the things you've mentioned. But I still remember my parents and all the educational system told us in school that freedom of speech is actually a Western concept and it's not our right. I only noticed and realized that it's also our right after I came to Vanderbilt. And also the government always brings up the idea of foreign power when we try to protest on this problem. So I have these questions like, how can we argue against this idea? Maybe not towards the government because it's more like a political stuff, but how do we raise awareness in China to try to tell people that freedom of speech is also our right? Thank you.
Let me go ahead and get, just because of the time, the rest of the questions, and then we'll combine them.
Yaniv Rega, Vernon Macon College, thank you. I'd like to re-echo the question of why is it that people nowadays are, or the belief in freedom of speech and classical liberal values is dissipating? Do you think that it has to do something with maybe the idea that people are simply losing faith in the presuppositions that we have under freedom of speech? Like, for example, the assumption that people are actually able to respectfully disagree with each other and come to some agreement instead of just being radicalized by each other. Like the assumption that the people arguing actually want the best for each other and for the community. Like the assumption that we have these civic commons to actually have these conversations in the first place. Thank you.
Okay, and two more questions here.
I just wanted to ask, in this discussion, it seemed like freedom of expression and security was like a choice that we had to make. I wanted to ask, why is that a choice that we have to make? Why can't we have both? And do we not get some sort of individual sense of security from knowing that we can express our ideas without being persecuted for them?
Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, so you mentioned that freedom of speech is not like a primal human value. Sometimes we're willing to give it up for other things like security. And that most often happens when people are polarized and when they view others as the enemy, and they're willing to give up democratic rights to defeat their enemies. You also mentioned that we're living in an increasingly digitized age, where these social media platforms tend to have business models that increasingly polarize people to keep them engaged on their platforms. So, what do you think we can do to combat those kind of echo chambers that are increasingly developing on social media platforms, and do you think that poses a threat to the value of freedom of expression? Thank you.
So just to summarize, okay, last question,
I have, two questions for Rodrigo. Do you know that Hamas using babies and children as human shield? And do you know that the Israeli Air Force, for example, were stopped many times for bombing and killing terrorists because there were children and women around, and they were stopped killing it? So that's the two questions. The comment is Israel does not kill everyone.
Okay, thank you. So you received that question. I don't think I have to repeat that one since there's the last one we just heard. And then the other 5 questions here is about New Zealand and about the question regarding China and how to explain that this is a right. That this is not, freedom of speech is not simply a Western concept, but it is also a universal concept, and to actually be able to explain that in China. And then also another question, just to summarize, is why are we still having to even talk about this, prove this, sell this? Should it just be automatically accepted as common sense? And then the next question was about security versus free speech. Doesn't free speech actually help create a more secure environment? And so why are we treating them as two different, or why are they even being discussed as in tension with each other? And then lastly, to answer the question regarding how do we address echo chambers online through social media platforms, particularly that are being administered through algorithms? Let's go, yeah.
Okay, I just want to, give I know this is about freedom of expression, but I just want to say what is happening for me in Gaza is if they see themselves as the same, the result will be different. It's just like a kidnap of people inside a bank. You need to resolve that they are the kidnappers, and you need to, they're threatening people's life, and then you need to attack them. You need to maybe eliminate them. But because this happened in your own country, you will never bomb the bank just to kill the innocent, the criminals. You will try to find a way, and knowing they're using a baby as human shield, but you will find a way to avoid the killing of the innocent people if you feel that you have to care from them. And just because of lack of vision that we have, that we are all the same, that's why this tragedy is happening. At least that's how I see it. Going back to the control of information, Maduro has 30% of popularity, 30%. We have the worst migration crisis in the world, more than Ukraine. We have gone through the worst scarcity and humanitarian crisis in the continent in history. 1/3 of the population left the country because of the crisis. And 30% of them, they still support the regime. Basically because the regime controlled 100% of the media. We even had an interim president 4 years ago, and some people never knew about that because they never saw the interim president being interviewed on TV. We just conduct a campaign right now with zero money. We won by 70%, but 30% of the people still believe that everything that is happening is because of the US. And the reason of this is because they control your access for information. So at the end, just to answer the question about China, how are you going to explain all this information to people? The problem that you have at the beginning is that you cannot access people. You cannot have these debates and inform people the importance of freedom of speech. You cannot access to free media to talk about this. So as soon as you control the access to information, you just have destroyed the freedom of speech because people will never have known the reality that is happening in your own country. So at the end, your opinion, it doesn't worth as it should be because basically you don't know what is really happening in your country. And that's how you control society. That's what happened in Venezuela.
Okay, I'll just say one thing because it's not going to be possible to respond to all the questions. But at the heart of all of this is capable citizenship. And capable citizenship comes with having citizens who have a capacity for information, to process things, and to be able to act with autonomy and agency, make their own decisions. From the part of the world that I come from, that also means, and when you listen to Salman yesterday, he said, free speech is also the right of the reader. But there cannot be a reader if you can't read. Okay? That sentence assumed that everybody can read, which is not true. I come from a country in which over 20 million children are out of school. There are out-of-school children there's a crisis of out-of-school children in the world. And by the way, no competition intended, but Sudan has the worst forced displacement crisis in the world at the moment. Over 11 million Sudanese out of school because of the war and out of home. Now, we've got to restore education to a pride of place in every conversation about free speech. Thank you.
I'm going to be the briefest. I'll try to be the briefest. Just to answer kind of common. I mean, Mauritania in 1980 was the last country that outlawed slavery. So think about that. We have been around for roughly 200,000 years as Homo sapiens, and the last country that outlawed slavery was only 40 years ago. So that tells you that the values of freedom are not common sense. So actually everything that we have, that we think of as human rights and freedom of expression, all of these values that we hold dear are not common sense. And there is a lot of work needs to be done to fight for them. On the China situation, I know it's obviously each kind of place is unique, but I can tell you what we found successful is that you want to, number one, show how it's important and relevant to the culture, and how can you find examples within the culture and within neighboring cultures that actually can resonate? Because for a message to go across, it has to resonate with the audience, and that's something that, so you can use the example of Taiwan, which is kind of nearby, but also has some relative freedom of speech compared to China, so that will be more beneficial. And I can tell you within kind of larger regions in Asia and Africa is that we actually do have a significant amount of successful examples in kind of passing human legislation, expanding freedom. So I think we do have a lot to play with, and I think we should double down on that instead of utilizing Western examples. that can be countered easily.
Well, thank you so much. And if you have just a few minutes to spend some time afterwards outside in the hall for people who have burning questions or didn't feel their questions were answered, please stay with us. And thank you all. Please join me in giving a round of applause for our panelists.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.